Yes, that's
So
right.
this is like putting them on the bed.
That's right. Often you go up to get your coat and you would see that it was occupied by people on the bed without it. And then put it upon the Okay.
Yep.
Can you hear that? And then back.
Mute and unmute. Right, fine.
Towards the jack. And that's you live now. If you want to test it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
just want to welcome you all to Reading Minster for this occasion. Thank you so much for coming on a Sunday afternoon in November. I hope it's not cold in here. We've just had the heating fixed, so hopefully you'll feel nice and toasty, and we will close the doors in a moment as well. My name is Sonia and I'm the Vicar of Reading Minster. And just a couple of notices before I hand over to Alan and our speakers today. We have a fair trade stall, which Hilary, who's waving down there, has some fair trade products. So if you're looking to do some shopping, Christmas shopping or otherwise, please do go down to Hilary in the centre there and have a look at her products. Good opportunity to do some shopping this afternoon. And we also have our local Christian Aid group here as well. So Phil is here, and he has some information about Christian Aid if you want to go and talk to him and get some information on that great charity. If you need the facilities, they're just through the decorative door on my right-hand side. Please do go and use them at any point when you need to. And we also have some beautiful refreshments this afternoon as well, so please do stay and join us for refreshments afterwards. Other than that, I'm going to hand over. He's not here. Going to hand over to Warwick. He'll tell us a little bit about... No, you're not coming up. You can get Alan.
Pardon? Could do.
Should we take a seat?
Yeah.
Would you want us in any particular order?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Right. Just add my own welcome to that from Sonia. I'm the other half, by the way. We just had a bit of delay, partly parking. That issue, Reading roads and traffic, is always something to be aware of, but also there's a little bit of prayer interlude happening around the side, so it will be another 5 minutes or so before we fully get going. It will be a time, therefore, for me to say that, I mean, this event is combines two things. One is a kind of annual lecture type event, which we try to promote in the Minster here, and also a kind of annual, what's called the Young Husband Lecture from the World Congress of Faiths. This being sort of at the end of Interfaith Week now, I think, aren't we? So-called, it's been running a long time, Interfaith Week. So it seemed to me and anyone else who was willing to listen that why don't we combine these two as it were, ventures on this occasion, and combine them in order to discuss, a very, very difficult situation right now in the Middle East, of course, and we all know about that. We read about it, we hear about it, we have formed opinions about it, and I'm sure that's the case. But it seemed to me that there's a lot of political commentary. I read it all, or most of it, but actually not huge amounts, as it were, from a clear religious background that comes out much. So let's have some sort of thought around that kind of approach, and that's kind of formulated the agenda for today and this afternoon. The World Congress of Faiths was formed in 1936, so coming up to 90 years old fairly soon, and so has been around a long time as an interfaith organization in this country, bits abroad, slightly less abroad now, I think, than when we first started. In 1936, a great, good number of intellectuals, people of different traditions, came together in London under the leadership of this man, Francis Younghusband. He'd been an adventurer, put it like that, in the Far East, and had quite a number of experiences, which he said, we need to really investigate one another, or explore one another, or share with one another more than we have done. And that was the basis for this meeting in London, which was terrific. If you want to read the proceedings of it, I've got a big fat book that'll tell you. But there were some of the best minds of the day that came together, as it were, interreligiously, we would say now. So that's to give you a clue about that background. We're just waiting on Imam Isa, so I think maybe the mini introduction will wait for him to be with us, I think. Good. Did Sonia tell you about refreshments? It's very important that, because there's a lot of them over there. Cakes, fruit, lots of beautiful samosas. Ah, good. You two met before? No. Okay. Imam Isa, Michael Hilton, and Patrick. Good. Come and sit here. So on the panel today we've got Imam Isa from the Canterbury Mosque and Madrasa Institute, if that's the right way to put it. I think so, and it's the first time we've met also. On my right is Rabbi Michael Hilton, whose main basis, this is correct I think, isn't it, is the Liberal Synagogue in St John's Wood, just near the cricket ground there. That's what everyone says. And then Patrick Watt, who's CEO at Christian Aid. The idea is that we'll have some words, I think, one following another, and then open the floor for a general discussion and exchange. On these occasions, of course, it's always important to just underline the rules a bit, the rules of listening and respect, essentially. And but that doesn't stop you from making a point that you want to make. If you want to make it quite strongly, that's fine. But listening and respect are two, key values, I think, on occasions like this. Okay, that's fine. I did, I think, say to you on an email, would you like to go first? Did you get that? Is that all right? Or do you want a minute to just collect yourself? Yeah, okay, I wondered, all right, we'll let that happen. Michael, I'm afraid it comes to you then. Michael, we've known each other a long time, and, he's an old hand at these kind of occasions, if I can put it like that.
Would it be okay if we change place?
Yes.
Right, so the first thing is, can you hear me? Excellent. It's a great honor to be one of the speakers at the annual Young Husband Lecture of the World Congress of Faiths and the annual lecture of Reading Minster. Alan's just told us about the published papers of that 1936 founding conference. And Sir Francis Younghusband, in his preface to the publication, wrote about unity of difference as the basic conception on which the conference was founded. And I think that's an important concept to bear in mind this afternoon, as we try to come to grips with what has to be done to build peace in the Middle East. Sir Francis' daughter wrote of him, "He was simple because he was single-minded, strong and clear-minded, knowing inside himself who and what he was and what he could and should do." So in that spirit, I am going to try to be very simple and clear this afternoon. Is peace possible? Yes. The plan of how it can happen has been known to the world since the Oslo Accords were signed in the 1990s. Accord 1 was signed in Washington, D.C. in 1993, and Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres, and Yitzhak Rabin jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1994. And then Oslo II was signed in Taba, Egypt in September 1995, and 6 weeks later, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, November 1995. We've not had a lot of progress since, but those accords still exist, based on UN resolutions 242 and 338. So when they are implemented, the West Bank and Gaza Strip will form a Palestinian state with land swaps along the so-called green line. It was a green crayon on a map originally, that marks the 1948 armistice. And in addition to those accords, there will need to be a settlement for Jerusalem, which gives faith groups, and I would say including interfaith groups, a major role, and a truth and reconciliation process leading to a historical acknowledgement of the refugee issue and appropriate restitution, either physical return or some kind of financial settlement. So I would say peace is possible. But is it possible in Gaza? My answer to that is also yes. The veteran Israeli negotiator Gershom Baskin, sadly ignored by Netanyahu, has it all worked out. He updates his plan and posts it on social media nearly every day. Within 3 weeks, the fighting could stop in Gaza. So peace is possible. But is it likely? Sadly, not at present. There are many reasons why not, but the one that's relevant to us at the World Congress of Faiths is, I think, also a very simple one. There are too many people in positions of authority on both sides of the conflict who believe and say, God is on my side. I heard Netanyahu say it at the UN a few weeks ago. He said it in Hebrew and didn't translate, but I certainly picked it up. And then, of course, Hezbollah is Arabic for the Party of God, and Hamas is also a faith-based movement. The general direction of travel of Israeli and Palestinian nationalism is no different from what we've seen in other countries around the world. Many places have become more isolationist with strong border controls, but in the Middle East we have, in addition, hard-line faith-based stances which often seem to mirror each other in their anger and ferocity. So, how do we, as people of faith and people of interfaith, respond? Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe in one God, expressed in our traditions as the same God, the God of Ibrahim, Avraham. Islam has been the closest religious partner Jews have ever had. There have been sharp differences and much conflict between the two faiths, but also a shared intellectual tradition which immeasurably enhanced the work of the greatest Jewish thinkers such as Saadia Gaon and Moses Maimonides, Solomon ibn Gabirol and Isaac Luria. The tragedy is that the partnership and the potential intellectual development which could still flow from the joint ventures of the past have been lost in our time. Bringing religion into the Middle East conflict in a negative way has implications for us and people of all faiths who are trying to build peace in the world. We need to raise our voices much louder in saying that in this particular conflict, God is not on one side. Israelis have rights, Palestinians have rights. I believe God demands that both rights should be defended. Sir Francis' young husband himself said that the first World Congress of Faiths conference was a place where it was desired emphatically that every individual might be inspired by a feeling for the whole. That's what we need right now. But in order to understand in more detail, a little bit more detail, how people react to the current war, we need to understand one by one, each and every one of us, who we are and what have been our experiences. And also where we are, because where you are geographically, if you're in Tel Aviv, Gaza City, or Reading, it makes a lot of difference. And so I have to speak personally to begin with myself and who I am. On the 21st of October last year, I took down from my shelf my hardback diary, which has its first entry dated 5th of March 1981, written in the middle of the English Channel on my way to the Jewish Christian Muslim Week in Germany. I very rarely write anything in it these days, but in October last year I've not been unable to concentrate on anything except the conflict in Gaza and my fears for the hostages and for the ordinary people of Gaza. And I knew that to get my thoughts in order, this was one occasion when I had to write them by hand in real ink on real paper. So I wrote at the top, to start me off, a quotation from the Jewish thinker, French Jewish thinker, Edmond Flegg. I am a Jew because in every place where suffering weeps, the Jew weeps. And that started me off. This is what I wrote. I lie awake at night, tormented by nighttime visions of suffering children, including babies. I weep for their pain. I do not know if the children in my visions are Israeli or Palestinian children, nor does it matter. The Israeli government has been planning to allow the single-chamber Knesset to overrule the Supreme Court, and that brought hundreds of thousands of Israelis on the street demonstrating every Saturday night against them, but there is nobody out there now because of what happened on October the 7th, 2 weeks ago. And I went on. At the same time as the October the 7th pogrom, thousands of rockets were launched towards Israel from Gaza, and immediately the Israeli Air Force began to respond, strafing Gaza with thousands of their own guided missiles. Gaza is a tiny area, about 25 miles by 6, with over 2 million residents, nearly half of whom are children. After 2 weeks, the number of children killed in Gaza is fast approaching the number killed in the entire Russia-Ukraine war back in the entire Russia-Ukraine war so far. I was 16 years old when the Six-Day War between Israel and all the surrounding countries broke out in 1967. My father took me to Kenton Synagogue for a rally. The speakers were saying, everyone must give, sacrifice, sacrifice. I heard it, but I was a teenage pacifist, and none of the speakers explained the history of what was going on. What had all this to do with me? When I went to university, I came to realize that my views were very out of step with almost all my fellow Jews in the UK. The old-fashioned non-Zionism, which had been dominant in British liberal Judaism in the 1920s and 1930s, had all but vanished. On my first visit to Israel in 1976, rather to my surprise, I felt immediately at home. I didn't speak Hebrew, but there was plenty of opportunity to argue in English. Indeed, the many debates on current topics were what distinguished being in Israel from other places I visited. One afternoon outing, however, was disturbing. We were taken to visit the ancient city of Hebron when we were shown around by a group of settlers. Yes, there were settlers back in the 1970s. The practice of Israelis moving into the 1967 territories was only just getting underway, and this group took us to see their new homes in a place they called by the ancient name Kiryat Arba. Their housing needs, however, were met in a very modern way, 4 grey tower blocks brooding menacingly over the ancient town. We were then taken down into the town, and the settlers told us proudly that their ambition was to live there. What we saw were rows of shuttered shops with nobody in sight. The whole place had a menacing air, which I vividly recalled on my second visit in 2018, by which time it had become far more menacing. Today's situation feels in some way like 1967, but there are very crucial differences. Most important this time, there will be no simple victory and no simple way out. Israel fights to destroy Hamas, but with no clear strategy how to achieve that without destroying Gaza as a whole. The other important difference is that unlike 1967, today, nearly every Jew in Britain and around the world has friends or family who live in Israel. We know what's happening almost immediately. And because Israel is a tiny country, all of us are only a couple of degrees away from someone killed or wounded or kidnapped. We are a community in anguish. All that I wrote last year, tragically, over the last 12 months, too little has changed. Today, we're in the midst of events just as troubling as October last year, and just like then, we're unable to distinguish true reports from false ones. All we can manage is not to act so much as to react. There's a line in the book of Proverbs, which I've often quoted in times of warfare. Proverbs chapter 27:19. Kamayim hapanim lapanim, ken lev ha'adam la'adam. Just as the water reflects one's face, so does one's heart reflect other human hearts. Now, in the past, I've thought of this in very positive terms. If I see my face in the other, if I see the other in myself, I feel good about them. I can reach out and begin to build trust. But now I realize that we can think of it negatively too. If I feel aggressive, I will notice aggression around me. And this is how war escalates, simply by copying the behavior, the perceived behavior of the other side. And we don't even realize it because in the midst of events, we cannot see the whole picture. And maybe that's why that passage from the book of Proverbs goes on with a terrible warning. Sha'ol va'avador lo tispana, ve'enei ha'adam lo tispana. The netherworld and destruction never have their fill, and human eyes never have their fill. Good or bad, we always want more of it. To truly turn from bad to good, from war to peace, is the most difficult task in life we ever face. October the 12th was our Day for Atonement, Yom Kippur, the first Day for Atonement after October the 7th last year. And in synagogues around the world, we read from Isaiah chapter 58, his powerful statement that the real message of fasting is sharing our food and our clothes and our homes with those who have none. Our Day for Atonement demands us do more than cleanse ourselves. It bids us help the world too. It is a day based around teshuvah, which means repentance, and demands of us an open heart. Tefillah, which means prayer, and demands of us an open mind. And tzedakah, which means charity, which demands of us an open hand. And this is how I think we must build peace, by opening our hearts, our minds, and our hands. Is peace possible? Yes. Is peace likely right now? No. But there is much, much more than we can do. We need to make this and similar organizations much stronger, to raise moderate religious voices, to stop saying God is on our side and say God is on both sides. I remember Dr. Sarah Bernstein, the director of the Rossing Center for Education and Dialogue in Jerusalem, who spoke these wise words to a mixed tour group I was on of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in 2018. She said, "Out here, if you are a friend of only one side, you are nobody's friend." Ultimately, my own Jewish response to the war is to invite everyone to open the compassion we all have inside us, and which is so much a part, so high a value, in the three Abrahamic faiths. And I'm just going to end with a poem. It's by David Rosenberg. It's a poetic reflection on Isaiah chapter 58. Act for others, not with faces, but with hands opening locks of injustice. Sophisticated knots tied mentally and physically around the poor and powerless, like a harness to break their spirit. Free them to break the locks, cut the reins of oppression, rise to the occasion, fast to free man's spirit. Make a day for opening your cupboards, sharing with the poor. Open your house, your heart, to the homeless. Look at the hopelessness around you. Put your hand through the invisible curtain and throw a coat around their shoulders. These are men and women flesh like you, desperate and blind outside the walls you built to hide in. The otherness you reach for is there, all around you, nakedly human to a soul undressed by kindness. Bare hands untying the cloak of self-serving pride and wrapping around a naked body, and then all around you as sudden as light, to eyes opening in the morning. The light within you breaks open as certain and irrevocable as dawn. That's not me, it's David Rosenberg paraphrasing the prophet Isaiah. May this be God's will.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving us some history, some biblical/theological reflection, and some personal story, all combined in one presentation. I'm going to quickly just move on to Imam Isa, who's had time to collect himself now a little bit, and invite him to address us as well now. Yeah? It's up to you. You want to stay seated?
Yes, please.
Well, you could use this.
There you are. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Imam Isa.
Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me? Is that clear enough?
Yeah.
All right. You need to pardon my voice. I had a surgery a few months ago. I'm still recovering. First of all, I would like to start my talk by saying Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. This is the Islamic greetings. And I'm so delighted to be amongst you, such a great pleasure. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here, for such an opportunity to speak to you. It's very interesting, actually, for me to talk about this topic. For me personally, I have a very strong bond and relationship with this particular subject. Actually, I'm from Jordan. I was born and grew up in Jordan. My mother is Syrian. My grandmother is Palestinian. So everything in my blood contains many roots. And unfortunately, the Middle East, you can see in my face the map and the roots. But it's quite emotional to talk about this kind of what's going on, and actually in Islam, I would like to start my talk about saying about the most important thing in Islam as Muslims, and in Quran speaks in details about this value. Is very significant and important value, which is called in Islam al-adl. Adl means justice against dhulm. Dhulm means oppression, injustice. And Islam tells us, emphasize this concept strongly in the Quran. Even in the Quran, God said, وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا وَإِنْ جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَاجْنَحْ لَهَا. If they incline to peace, then incline to it and rely upon Allah and stand firmly for justice, even if it be against you personally. That Islam tells us about as Muslims, we perceive this value and this standard should be applied to everyone regardless of his ethnicity, background, race, color. And that's why you find many, many verses in the Quran that tells us. I would like to say one of the meaning of justice in Islam is to give everyone his due right without bias and favorism. Everyone agrees about it. And for us actually to understand the conflict and what's going on in the Middle East, we have to understand the reality and the history. I totally agreed with the Rabbi about it's absolutely devastating, breaking the heart when you talk about what's going on. But we need to be frankly, honestly, talk about how can be religion misused and used in the wrong context when can be used terms and they can put in the wrong context, and then the violence will be justified. When we talk about the promised land, and after that, everything that follows after that will be justified to justify that we are given the promised land. So we don't have to understand that as Muslims. Let us say, I want to throw a lot of the questions for you. You reflect and ponder upon it, and then after that we can talk about it. But my question is, how do ordinary Palestinian, Gazan people perceive what's going on? How do children of Gaza until now, how do they perceive what's going on, and the attack and the displacement and the occupation and what's going on? How do Jordanian people perceive the conflict there? How do Egyptian people perceive that? Because actually Palestine over there is not actually isolated island which nobody around it. Is surrounded by countries and people. They actually they perceive and they understand and they comprehend truly the political conflict. A lot of times, why do people actually in Gaza, they call whoever is being killed, they call a martyr? Whether you agree or disagree, whether from Hamas or not, why do they call them legends and champions? There's a question. We would like to think about it. Why do people, until now, a lot of Gazan children, they are desperate to join and to try to, they perceive it as actually as an occupation. So the root causes of this concept and this conflict is very important for us to understand. When you go back 7 decades, what happened? 7 decades ago, and then what happened? As Muslims, when we start about the question is peace possible? I wouldn't say that. I would say not possible. Has to be a necessity and obligatory. Not only possible, we must, as Muslims, strive to seek as a religious obligation, not only just possible that we can, actually is an option, we can take or we can leave. Absolutely not. For Muslims, the first thing we greet is peace be upon you. Islam, there's an ayah, verse explicitly said, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu udkhulu fi silmi kafa. O you who believe, you must enter peace exclusively and inclusively, and comprehensively. So as Muslims, we strongly believe that peace must be sought by everyone. But we need to understand the causes and the cause roots for this conflict and this. For us, one of the points is I would like to share with you in this evening that in Islam, when you go back, when Jerusalem was shared and Palestine was shared land between Muslims and Christians and Jews, at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, the Khalifate, who actually took, and at his time, he had the opportunity to rule and to govern Jerusalem, and he refused strongly to exclude any parties. And you go to Jerusalem, to go to the Middle East, you see the Middle East has many minorities. They were living peacefully You go to Damascus, you go to Jerusalem, there's a lot of places there. These places, until now, they are actually people, they practice their religion freely, willingly, and that will show you that Islam is absolutely against violence and will never support violence. And we need to look at that. Islam does not wait for a disaster to take place. Islam usually will give us the precaution and the vaccine, I would say, before disaster takes place. That's why in Islam, the concept of peace goes hand in hand with justice, inseparable. You can't separate them. Peace must be based on the foundation of ultimate justice and dignity and free. And sometimes when we talk about the history, when the treatment, the covenant, and what happened between Yasser Arafat and that time Benjamin was Rabin, it was a great opportunity for peace. But a lot of people, they think for a few years is actually peace is not just merely by the absence of violence. It's actually the presence of justice. And that's why this is, before what happened in October, a lot of people from Gaza, from outside the Gaza, they were talking that people in Gaza, they weren't living perfectly, freely. Before that happened, there's reasons, there's causes, there's things that we need to understand what's going on. It didn't come from vacuum. So the point is actually, this is the fruit of a lot of, I would say, the strong connection and the encouragement for the settlers to expand wrongly, and people they see. And again, many times when we talk about Gaza exclusively and particularly, and we neglect, or sometimes unintentionally, we neglect and ignore the condition and the state of the West Bank, where there's no military Hamas actually force over there. But is West Bank in the best ideal condition? Yesterday, a few days ago, I had a conversation with a student in Canterbury. He's a student, but his family in West Bank. And I asked him a very small question. I said, how long would it take you to go from Ramallah to Jenin, which is just only 35 kilometers? He said it would take 3-4 hours. 3-4 hours to get there because of the checkpoints. And people, they grow up, they have dignity. And they see the kind of humiliation. They see their relatives in Gaza, they are massively humiliated and killed. How would they react as human beings? You can't expect them to be to have no dignity, no values, no shame or no respect. In Jordan, why people? They prostrate and they protest and demonstrate outside the Israeli embassy. Simple question, why? So other things for my question is, I try to understand, for a lot of people in Gaza, when I speak to them, guys, why do you understand until now you still resilient, resistant? That's a big question for me. I try to figure it out. For my question, I will conclude, is one of the things in Islam that we don't have, as Muslims, we don't have a problem with Jews, Christians, and other faith group. But the problem always when the religion is being misused and used by political groups to gain worldly gains and benefits. That's the problem. The same thing when as Sunni, Muslim Sunni, we say we don't have a problem with even Shia in Iran. But we say, but when the Shia are used for political reason, there's the problem. And that's why a big goal, this massive call out, as a shout out for the Jews to wake up and to not allow themselves to be misused for the political leaders for political gains and gains at the end, who pay the cost for this game? The ordinary people. I'm trying to understand for the next generation of the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, how would they grow? What their aspiration? How would they perceive the hope in the future? Can I go as a preacher, as a Muslim imam, talk to them over there about peace? Would they respond to me? Would they actually listen to me when they say to me, listen, I've lost all of my families. And a little child will say to me, I lost my mom. Can you bring her back? After that, we can talk about peace. This is very hard for me. I'm sorry, actually, my voice is not really helping me. But
draw to a close.
Yeah, I think, again, I hope this will come to an end. I was hoping that it was just only a nightmare. Since that happened, the conflict, the attack, since that happened, I'm feeling every day, it's a nightmare. Is it going to be an end for this thing? It seems longer than what I thought. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.
Thank you very much. Misused religion is a phrase that I think you had there, which raises, for me at least, the question of whether there is something in religious affiliation that somehow allows it to be misused. Seems to me that's a real kind of question that I come across in many writings on peace and justice and so on, articles here and there. So thank you. I'm going to move straight on now to Patrick, who's, as I said earlier, CEO for Christian Aid in the region. As we know, the Christian world has been present there for a long time, but a small presence. Perhaps you'll tell us a bit about that, as well as any role that might be possible.
Great, thank you, Alan. Can I just check I'm audible to all of you? Yep, very good. Like you, sir, I'll stay seated, but hopefully I'll still be able to engage you. So, look, I'm going to answer the question, is peace possible? Neither as a professional theologian, although I have studied theology, nor as a specialist in peace building, nor in the Middle East. But as Chief Executive of Christian Aid, I lead an organization that has worked in the Middle East since the 1950s, worked in partnership with both Israeli and Palestinian organizations, also works currently in northwest Syria, in Lebanon, and in the last 20 years has also at different times worked in Egypt and in Yemen and in Iraq. And we're an organization that is rooted in and was founded by the British and Irish churches and works very intentionally with people of all faiths and beliefs. And we do that because we're a Christian organization, not in spite of it. So I think it's important to kind of frame actually the question before I answer it, because the Middle East is not home to one conflict, and Isa actually touched on this to an extent. It's actually home to multiple overlapping conflicts in which religious identities and interests often play a role, but as in other parts of the world, are interwoven with other identities and interests. and those include ethnic, ideological, and economic factors. And it's an obvious point, but it's often lost in commentary about the region, particularly, I think, in this country, that the religious fabric of the region is complex, and it's evolving, and it doesn't neatly map on to lines of conflict. And that's true of Israel and Palestine, but it's also true of other parts of the region. So, to take one example, Syria's civil war, a horrendous war, a war that has killed more than 500,000 people since it started, that has displaced more than a third of the population, that has taken Syria from being an upper middle income country on course to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals to being a low income country. That war is often described as a conflict between an Alawite Shia minority and a Sunni majority. But the landscape's much more complex than that. Many Sunnis, particularly middle-class Sunnis, as well as Druze and many Christians, have actually seen the lesser of two evils in the Assad regime. In Yemen, the conflict between the Houthi rebels associated with the Zaidi branch of Shia Islam and the Sunni-dominated Yemeni government forces that has killed 400,000 people since 2014 is actually a much more complex conflict than is often portrayed. Many Zaidis do not support the Houthis, and until recently in Yemen, the distinction between Sunni and Shia has been much less defined than in other parts of the Middle East. In Egypt, over 10,000 people killed by the government counterinsurgency in Sinai against the Muslim Brotherhood. Essentially, has been a conflict amongst Sunni Muslims, with competing visions of the place of religion in the public square, with the country's Copts, the largest Christian minority in the Middle East, often caught in the middle. So these conflicts, as is the case with the conflict in Israel and Palestine, have deep historical roots. And again, both Michael and Issa touched on that. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which, while it had legally discriminated against religious minorities, also afforded them some level of recognition and security, led to the creation of nation states whose legitimacy was often based on much more exclusive appeals to ethno-religious identities. And in that sense, of course, the creation of Israel is of a piece with the creation of majority Christian Lebanon, or the creation of states which, after sometimes experimenting with secular nationalism or pan-Arabism, sought to anchor themselves in religious and tribal loyalties. And in one respect, the last century or so in the Middle East, bookended by the Armenian genocide and the current terrible human toll in Gaza, can be seen as the slow unpicking of a patchwork quilt of ethnic, linguistic, and religious identities that had coexisted, often uneasily, under the Ottomans for over 600 years. The conflicts in the region also, it hardly needs saying, are not simply regional. International involvement in the region over the last century can in many cases be traced back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration. But it also reflects a much longer and wider history of Western and Russian intervention and of Persian-Arab contestation, which continues to this day. And these interventions have often, if not only, been driven by cynical self-interest over the resources in the region and its role as a staging post between Europe and Asia. So all of this is a roundabout way of saying it would be simplistic and misleading to think that the conflicts in the Middle East are straightforwardly religious. And that is as true of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Arabs in the territory that's now known as Israel and the occupied territory of the West Bank and Gaza as it is in the rest of the region. And of course, perspectives within Israeli society about the role of the Jewish religion and the extent to which Israel's legitimacy rests on religious claims to the land varies enormously. And we saw those tensions playing out in the huge anti-government protests in Israel before October the 7th. Of course, the Zionist project in many ways in its origins was driven largely by secular Jews, and many of the Haredi community do not recognize the legitimacy of a secular Jewish state. And by the same token, amongst Palestinians, there are deep fault lines between those advocating a political project that foregrounds Islam, like Hamas, and those, including most Palestinian Christians, who advocate a more secular nationalist project. And those fault lines run deep through Palestinian politics, civil society, and culture. As elsewhere in the region, many of the most bitter disputes about the interface between politics and religion are within religious traditions, not necessarily between them. Now, I'm not wanting to overstate my point. Religion is, of course, a major social and political force in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the fact that our three faiths represented here on the panel today all have a deep and particular relationship to the place that Christians call the Holy Land is, of course, important. And it has to be understood and recognized if we're to make effective progress towards peace. But many people in Israel and Palestine, including, it has to be said, most of the Palestinian Christians with whom I've engaged, will argue that at root, the conflict is territorial and ethnic rather than religious, with exclusive and exceptional claims to the land from people on both sides perpetuating the cycle of violence. And therefore, I think to treat it as a conflict that can be solved primarily through interreligious dialogue is misguided and misleading. Now, that does not mean that religious communities and institutions are mere bystanders to the conflict, nor that co-religionists globally do not have an important role to play in fostering peace. And I want to reflect briefly on 4 areas where I think that people of our three faiths do have a serious responsibility in relation to the region's conflict, and particularly to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. So firstly, I think we have a fundamental responsibility not to amplify and add to the animosities that already exist in how we talk about the conflict and default to taking sides. Often the Israel-Palestine conflict has become a lens through which other local conflicts are refracted. I think of Northern Ireland, where nationalists fly the Palestinian flag and loyalists the Israeli flag. Or Nigeria, where Pentecostalist Southerners and Muslim Northerners similarly tie their colours to the mast. And the irony in that taking of sides is that the faces and the voices of people directly impacted by the violence and injustice of the current situation are often obscured rather than illuminated. Framing the conflict in the region as a cosmic battle between good and evil, oppressed and oppressor, in which people pick a side and decide which side is which, is, I think, unlikely to hasten its resolution or reduce the sum of human suffering. Secondly, people of faith from outside the region have a responsibility to hold difference well, without relativizing that difference or normalizing the violence that scars the lives of people in Israel and Palestine. And I'd argue that we're all called in our lives to model genuine encounter between people who disagree on fundamental issues, and even people who may have done great violence. And I think here of Yocheved Lifshitz, an 85-year-old hostage of Hamas in Gaza who, on her release earlier this year, shook hands with one of her captors. When she attempted to explain her gesture to a sometimes uncomprehending and even hostile Israeli public, she said, "We are sick and tired of fighting. Let the people speak to one another." Peace is made with enemies, not friends. Although over time, our understanding of enemies and their understanding of us may open us up to the possibility of friendship. I think it's also worth restating the truism, which happens to be true, that peace is made of people by people who are themselves at peace in their own hearts and within their communities. Now, all of our faiths hold the idea of wholeness or holiness and integrity, in which it's recognized that the transformation of the world that God intends cannot take place unless we are also willing to be transformed. The first step then to establishing peace is to establish a culture of peace within ourselves. Thirdly, people of our three faiths have practical and important work to do in the management of religious sites to which multiple communities lay a claim. From Jerusalem's Temple Mount, Dome of the Rock, to the Ibrahimi Mosque, Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. And we need to be intentional about how we make pilgrimages to those sites. Perhaps, in the flawed and cacophonous coexistence of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, at one level, a grim monument to Christian division, lies a pointer to where an imperfect peace in the future might lie. And in reflecting on the holy sites, we should be asking ourselves, to what extent do our pilgrimages deepen or reduce hostility and incomprehension? To what degree are we escaping from or facing up to the grim political realities of the region and actively seeking understanding of conflicting and competing viewpoints? Or are we content to float above these realities in our own little spiritual bubbles? Finally, we must be clear that peace is possible with justice, but impossible without it. And I'm defining justice here as right relationship between the people who live between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. The ability to live with security, with dignity, and self-determination. The Christian Aid doesn't take a view on precisely what political settlement is needed to create those conditions of security, dignity, and self-determination. And there are different models of sovereignty out there that are worth exploring. However, I think it is clear that the current cycles of violence will repeat with more terrible consequences until the imbalance in power and the imbalance in economic and social well-being and the legitimate underlying concerns of all people about security are addressed through a durable political settlement. And for that to happen, we have to be willing to call injustice and violence for what it is, to pursue accountability for acts that cross ethical and legal boundaries, and to stand with those who, often on the margins of Palestinian and Israeli society, are calling for a future of peaceful coexistence. And I'd like to end with a short prayer that Christian Aid wrote some 20 years ago. It stands at the back of St. George's Anglican Cathedral in Jerusalem, and sadly it's as relevant now as it was when it was first coined. Pray not for Arab or Jew, for Palestinian or Israeli, but rather pray for ourselves, that we may not divide them in our prayers, but hold them together in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. If there's anything that comes out of that, certainly for me anyway, it's the business of complexity, which you made very clear, I think. So thank you for that. We have, let me see, 40 minutes before it's 5 o'clock, and that's time for some questions or some comments. Just one rule about comments and all of that. If I feel that there's a sermon going on, I might have to intervene. Okay, so a question or a comment, please be as concise as you can in order to give people, a good chance for a spread of response. And yeah. So Warwick is administrator in the World Congress of Faiths, and he's very good with a microphone. So I'll point out various people to go to, and you can find your way. Thanks.
Manage that.
Okay. Anybody want to start us off? Yeah.
Maybe over here.
Okay.
I think you were first, yeah.
Thank you very much for the talks. I want to share with you the only hopeful aspect, or the main hopeful aspect that I've seen in terms of the conflict. And that is the group of people known as the Bereaved Families Forum, and the combatants for peace. And they have dialogues. I'm glad you're nodding, Michael, that's fantastic. They have dialogues between bereaved people on both sides of the conflict. And when you listen to those dialogues, you hear so much pain and so much suffering. And you hear people say, this is how it is, and justice is very much part of those dialogues and the lack of justice. But by doing that work and making those connections between individuals, and they go into schools as well and talk to people, they are forging a potential new reality which is impossible to see in any other context at the moment.
Thank you. I think that was more of
another one,
a comment than a question.
Hi, I was just going to mention the elephant in the room, which is the involvement of outside powers like the United States, Russia or the Soviet Union and others. I always get the feeling that if people were left to some extent to come to their own arrangements without the dispute being used by outside powers for their own purposes, we might be a bit closer to some sort of resolution. I don't know if the panel has a view on that.
The question is whether we haven't named the elephant in the room, which is the role of outside powers, the United States, whoever, and some others. Iran never mentioned, but that's awesome. Okay. Yeah, well, we've got mics here.
You've got mics.
Do you want to have a go at that?
I mean, as we say, the Middle East is a very complicated area where everyone has an interest in this area, as been mentioned. And absolutely, I totally agree with what you said. Is actually people they left alone to deal with, get on with their own issues without being any interference. We mentioned about Syria. Syria, we see about Syria was a very good country. I've been there before the war. And what happened after? The major issue that prevented from any kind of both parties to come to compromise is the interference from both sides. And that's what is exactly happening right now in Palestine and Gaza. Is actually, they've been massively, I would say, Netanyahu is being massively supported and given weapons, and that would give him that ultimate support to continue his operation. And his, I would say, I would call it, whether you agree with me, I call it genocide, with over 40,000 people, they've been slaughtered. Just small point I would like to comment. For me, as Muslims, we side, when you see two people, one of them is what actually, you see the murderer and you see the murdered. I can't side with the murderer. Simple as that. And for me, when I see over 50,000, there's no justification ever I can accept as a human being, before I'm Muslim, to kill for 50,000 in order. Why? Because the excuse, we want to destroy Hamas. That's absolutely is something I can't, as Muslims, until now the Middle East people, they cannot actually comprehend it. You want to destroy Hamas, you've killed 50,000. This kind of endless dispute will never end. And that's, for me, I have to decide whether oppressed, again, is the oppressor.
So I mentioned I was a teenage pacifist. I think one thing that hasn't changed in my beliefs for all those years is my abhorrence of the international arms trade. I think it's wrong for any country to sell weapons to another country. And indeed it was codified by our great lawgiver Moses Maimonides, who in his philosophy, he quoted Islamic philosophers on every page. But he gave a very pragmatic reason for it. He said, how do you know, if you sell someone a weapon, that that weapon might not one day be used against you? It's not really, I suppose, a moral argument, and yet it is. So if you took the international arms trade out of any of the conflicts which has been mentioned this afternoon, clearly the deaths and the maimings and woundings would be much less.
I'm not sure to what extent it's realistic that the rest of the world will ever disengage fully from the Middle East. I think partly the geography of the region, the fact it's a natural crossroads, the natural resources of the region, I think mean that international engagement in the region is inevitable. I think the question is what kind of engagement and on what terms. I think in addition to the issues that have already been talked about, I think there is a real question about the extent to which the United States and to some extent European countries, including this country, can be seen as and trusted as honest brokers in any process towards peace and a durable political settlement. And I think it's very voices in the global south who feel, well, if Ukraine has the kind of backing of the West, then war crimes against the Ukrainian people somehow don't matter. Of course, they do matter, but so do war crimes against the Palestinian people, or for that matter, war crimes against Israeli people on October the 7th. And there are depressingly few consistent advocates of international law amongst the governments of the world. And my worry is that we are at an inflection point now where, a bit like Rwanda or Bosnia, we are seeing the trampling of international law. And if we are not careful, we will be left with nothing but the law of the jungle. And I think that makes the prospects of peace more remote.
Okay, and then there was a lady with a hand up before. Sure.
Hi. I agree. The premise of this conflict or any other conflict is definitely not religion. If we go back 1,000 years, Jews were persecuted in Europe. They were never persecuted by Muslims. Indeed, Imam Isa mentioned Umar al-Khattab when he conquered Jerusalem. He was welcoming to the Jews. He wasn't just welcoming to the Jews. Jews existed there. They were exiled. And he asked the people to bring the Jews back to the Jewish quarter that was empty. When Salahuddin Ayyubi defeated the Crusaders in Jerusalem, I'm not giving a talk on history, but I have to give this background to make my point. Defeated Richard the Lionheart. He was first of all praised for his sense of justice and fairness in war. But again, he brought back the Jews who had been exiled as well. Jews have always been persecuted. There's no doubt about that. And what happened in the Second World War is absolutely atrocious. We should learn from it. But back to the premise of religion, Muslims were entrusted with the key to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to this day. So there was never a problem between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But today we have a narrative that demonizes Muslims and Islam. Many Muslim women cannot walk around with hijabs and so on and so forth. And we need to challenge the narrative by the media and by the politicians, because our history as Muslims and what we contribute to the world is being erased as we speak. And we are being demonized to be able to justify a war on a territory that actually is the gateway to the world's greatest resources of oil and gas and whatever not. Thank you.
Have a second one? Or?
One response. There was a woman at the back, and then David. Two over that direction. You go first.
Since October the 7th last year, attacks on both Jews and Muslims in this country have skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And this is a very important issue where we Jews and Muslims in Britain have to stand together and do a lot more for our own individual relationship, as well as standing up to hatred. We must not allow what is happening in the Middle East to continue to damage our community relationships in this country. We've already had, back in August, I was out of the country, so I was never quite clear what was happening, the riots that took place here, which were fed by Islamophobia. And we've seen throughout the last year, only a couple of weeks ago, a horrible demonstration outside Jewish Community Centre in London, where there's a group come together to discuss peace. So sadly, these things are happening right now here in this country, and there's one level on which this should be our first priority, to deal with that.
Thanks.
Yeah?
Hello. Hello, can you hear me? This is probably more a question for Patrick, and it's going off the religion piece a bit. I just wondered, because I've been following the news on how much aid is getting into North Gaza, and there obviously isn't a lot. So, I mean, how can different religious organisations kind of work together to get more in, or is that even a possibility?
Yeah. So my hearing's not great, but I think you were asking a question about...
Okay, sorry.
You were asking a question about aid getting into Gaza, and particularly North Gaza.
So, aid getting into North Gaza, because there's been a lot of coverage during the media earlier in the week that there's nothing getting in. So,
Yeah.
just if you had any kind of intel on that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's about aid getting in.
So I think the question is about how much aid is getting into Gaza, particularly to northern Gaza, and is there a role that religious organisations can play in getting humanitarian aid to people who need it? I think and Michael and I were actually talking about this before the panel started. I think the reality in Gaza is more complex than is often being portrayed in the media. So there's been a lot of blocking of the official UN aid supplies into Gaza at different points for different reasons. However, a lot of private trade is still going on, which is what has, for the most part, prevented outright starvation. There is huge malnutrition. There are huge health problems. There's an increasing lack of access to clean water. But the reason things aren't even more perilous is because private supplies have continued to get in, and the banking system has continued more or less to function. And that has enabled Christian Aid and enabled some other organizations to transfer monies to organizations in Gaza that have then been able to provide humanitarian assistance. And we're doing that with both organizations that partnered with us before October the 7th and some new organizations. And that includes both Christian organizations, the Orthodox Church in Gaza City, for example, but also secular Palestinian organizations. The situation in the north of the Gaza Strip is extremely dire. And there, right now, kind of de facto siege conditions are being imposed, particularly on Jabalia, and that's taking a terrible human toll, and very little is getting in there, very little of anybody's aid supplies. The situation further south is more mixed. I don't want to in any way downplay the gravity of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I mean, it is absolutely desperate, but I think it is also the case that organizations are able to do some work to alleviate the most extreme suffering. And it's really a testament to the resilience, I think, and ingenuity of the civilian population in Gaza that things aren't even worse than they are.
There's one there and then up to David.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm from Syria, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived in peace for decades, and it's majority Muslims that rule the country. And I'm close by where Palestine is on the borders. But my question is, where Jerusalem is a land for everyone, what gives the right for one party to take over the whole country? And when Israel started, they had dots on the map. Now Palestinians have dots on the map instead. And as we speak today, as of this moment, Palestinians are being killed. Children, women, old, young, it doesn't matter, they are being killed. So what gives the right to one party to use the religion, which is the Jewish religion, to cleanse everyone else?
There is no injunction in the Jewish religion for ethnic cleansing in our time. Some people have drawn a comparison with a book of Joshua, when the ancient Israelites were instructed by God to go into the land. And indeed, the far right in Israel has quoted from it. Nevertheless, the prevailing rabbinic commentaries over the centuries on that book have said this was intended to be a one-only event. It was not intended to be a precedent for future times. From the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70 of the Christian era, right up until the 20th century, Jews did not bear arms unless they were press-ganged into the Russian army, places like that, and fought in other wars. But there was no Jewish army, there was no Jewish fighting. Israel was set up by vote of the United Nations that called for a partition of the land. It was put to the United Nations by the occupying power, Britain, under the mandate they'd been given from the League of Nations in 1922, I think it was. And Britain withdrew from the area, leaving the Jews and the Arab countries to fight it out, just as they left Muslims and Hindus to fight it out in Kashmir. And the conflict in Kashmir still going on, as it is in the Middle East. And in fact, there is far too little recognition in this country of the part Britain has played in the background to these damaging conflicts. So we have to build a new narrative, one which is not based on warfare and certainly not ethnic cleansing. And this is why I said very clearly that moderate religious voices have to speak much louder and not allow the shouting to be done by the extremists.
Fair point.
If you stand up, please.
Yes, of course. Thank you.
We need David as well next. Okay.
Okay. Thank you to the speakers. I am reminded many, many times how incredibly fortunate we are here in Reading. I think the very least we can do is hold everyone who suffers on both sides of any conflict in our thoughts and our prayers. And I think that the other thing that we can do is set a good example here in Reading to give hope for communities such as you have described so vividly that are so much less fortunate than ours. I'm very privileged. I'm involved in an organisation called the Reading Interfaith Group, We're very used to eating Noah's pudding, which is a lovely reminder of our shared humanity. It's really nice. I don't know whether rabbis had a chance to have some Noah's pudding, but I do recommend it to mark the festival of Ashura. We talk a great deal about bridge building, and I'm very aware that quite often in events like this, we can say the words peace and justice in one breath. But that is a huge span to cover, because our present reality for so many people is not peace but war, and not justice but injustice. That's an absolute massive span for any human being to cover. And I think we do have to hold on very strongly to our faiths to be able to even attempt that, our faiths in a supreme power and our faith in each other. I'm also really glad that Noah sent that dove out twice and wasn't put off the first time around. But my question, because I know you don't want a sermon, you want a question, is what would you like to happen as a result of this event? What materials, how are we going to build about bridge building here in Reading?
Do you want to have a go?
Who's from Reading?
I'm happy to start. I suspect I'm the least qualified of the panel. What would I like to see happen? I would like us to pray for peace. I mean, as Christian Aid, we believe in the power of prayer. We ask our supporters to pray as well as to give and to take action. I think we have to model good dialogue, which doesn't mean kind of kumbaya coziness that glosses over difference, but genuinely good dialogue in our communities and in our work. I have a regular meeting. The next meeting is coming up next week with my counterparts at World Jewish Relief, at Islamic Relief, and at CAFOD, the Catholic Agency. I think that's a really important space for us to explore how we can not only kind of work together practically internationally, but actually how we engage our supporters here in Britain on issues of peace and injustice in ways that don't deepen some of the divisions that already exist, sadly, in our society. And I think we should also take time to understand the history and the context of the issues we're talking about. I mean, to Michael's point, this country has a deep historic responsibility for the conflict we're talking about today. And it doesn't mean that Britain can solve the problems, but it has to engage with them, recognizing that historical responsibility. And I would like to see that playing out much more in the policy of this government and this parliament than is the case currently. And so perhaps with that in mind, engaging with your members of parliament on these issues, Christian Aid has campaigned for unfettered humanitarian access, for international judicial accountability for war crimes, for an end to arms exports to the region for this very reason. So I would encourage all of you to engage with your members of parliament on that agenda.
Thank you. Okay.
In terms of this event, one of the things what the sister just mentioned, I would like to stress that there's a related issue between the conflict what's going on in Palestine and between the Israeli government and the Palestinian, but as a Muslim community and Christians and Jewish community here, the Muslim community, they've been actually struggling with a very, very important issue we mentioned earlier about the far right, their attack, is that the Islamophobia definition. The Muslims, they've been portrayed as a potential terrorist. And a lot of them, they have kind of the fear for all of them to go and to identify themselves as Muslims. A lot of them, they have that kind of fear to go and be different, to be proud of being different in terms of positively as a group of faith. That's something very important from the people to perceive again and redefine Islamophobia, getting closer. And I would suggest even more workshop to understand that kind of fear and that kind of observation from Muslim community. That will give them that kind of relief that their community trying to contain them, or try to understand them. And that will deepen the bond between the communities. I think very important for us, because actually a lot of Muslims, fellow Muslims, they've been actually watching live stream for more than, I would say, 16, 8 months. The attack has been happening on their own brothers in Gaza. And again, the Muslims, they strongly, heavily supported the idea when Ukraine was invaded. We stood firmly that Ukrainian people, they were invaded, they are oppressed. And as a Muslim, this is a value, this is one of the religious obligations to stand with Ukrainian because they've been invaded, oppressed, and killed and persecuted, regardless of their religion. But we get lost sometimes. We get really massively confused when we see the exact same case, but the standard has been changed. What's going on? Gaza, Ukraine. Oh, but the color is different. The color is different.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, I think.
I think well, David was first a while ago, and then we can come to Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, yes, I think we have to be a lot better at history and much more careful with our language. The previous speaker picked up part of what I want to say, which is this rather cozy language that Christians are often inclined to use, the language of peace and justice. We were doing this in the 1970s, and peace and justice will be marvelous. And we never get it unless we work very hard and use the right language and analysis. This isn't about peace and justice. We should use the word injustice. I think you made that point, actually. It's about injustice, and a very long-standing injustice that's been going on in the Middle East for a very long time. No point starting with the Oslo Accords, which the rabbi did. No. I mean, we go back at least 17 years. Okay, that's only the start of the Gaza blockade, but we have to go right back to 1948. This is the start of the apartheid state. Absolutely monstrous. It's been built up by degrees, sometimes gradually, sometimes with appalling force, with support from the United States. This goes back at least 76 years, and we've really got to do a lot of reading and construct a language, actually, that recognizes that. And the second piece of language is about war. I think the word war, this isn't a war, it's genocide. I mean, this has been a genocide. It's been evident that this is a genocide that's been working through for several months now. And also, when we talk about terrorism, we must figure out who is doing the grossest acts of terror. And this is evident. It's sections of the Israeli Defense Force. The IDF is a misnomer. It is not a defense force. It's the most sophisticated terrorist group, or sections of it are, and it's those that do the killing. I would use the word murder rather than killing. It's that's been gathering atrocious force. So let's use the correct words to describe what's actually going on. Otherwise, we won't get the political momentum. So I will conclude with a question. I would like to ask Rabbi Michael, what action, if any, and my grandson's other grandparents are Jewish. My little boy was with me yesterday, proud to wear his kippah. I would like to know what action is being taken amongst the synagogues in London and the UK generally to protest against what is happening, because unless this is deeply rooted, and I must speak to my grandson's granddad. I plan to do this next week and go to synagogue. Where is redemption for the Jewish people? Because theologically, we won't move forward unless large numbers of our Jewish friends begin to pray for redemption, because that's what the Netanyahu government should be doing. It should be on its knees praying for redemption.
Yeah.
book length answer.
I think one of the most damaging things that we say in conflicts like this is that if you are a bystander, you are complicit. I don't agree with that. I have a right as a British Jew not to be a journalist and make political comments. I have an absolute right, if I wish, along with my fellow British Jews, to remain silent. I have an absolute right as a British Jew to be neither supportive nor destructive to the cause. I intend to continue to speak about the morality and the ethics and the history, and that is my contribution. And that is my answer.
Your second. Many thanks. Can I take the advantage of some serious theologians on the table in front of me, including Patrick, because you said you had a theological degree. But it seems to be we're in a world of perpetual warfare, and conflicts go on and on and on. And it struck me that especially interfaith dialogue should deal with a theology of perpetual warfare. How does our theology accommodate the living in warfare which doesn't end?
Thank you. You want to have a go at that? How does our theology have something to say in times and places when warfare doesn't seem to have an end? We've sort of said a few things about that already, I think, but there may be other things anybody wants to say. Yeah. You've come all this way, so you
All right. I would say in Islam we don't have a blessed war or something. I think the point is that we all agree that this land is very sacred for everyone. And by the text, they've been, as I mentioned earlier, they've been misused to encourage people to fight for the political cause, as we said earlier. I think for us as Muslims, we deeply desire peace. And every day, in my prayer, in my mosque, every day we do 5 daily prayers, and we dedicate the last unit in my prayer to call for peace, to help the children in this weather, in the coldness of this weather in the winter when they are living in tents. And many times you see, as I mentioned, we have to separate and between the, of course, as religions, we respect, and in Islam, Quran speaks highly, respectfully about Moses and Jesus. By the way, my name is Isa, which means in English, Jesus. It was very interesting. One time I mentioned it when I used to be a chaplain in a hospital, and I said to him, my name is Jesus. He looked at me and said, are you okay, man? I said, listen, this is a translation of, actually in Islam, that's my question, and that's why yesterday I was, what is the position? As Muslims, if I see anyone insulting Jesus, or Moses, or Torah, or Bible, in Islam is absolutely disgraceful. We respect the prophets and messengers. You cannot be Muslim if you don't believe in Moses and Jesus. But the position is, and the question arises, when we see a lot of Zionists, they come and insult and humiliating mosques, Quran, and these videos, they've been used by others to provoke violence. We need to hear the voice of condemning this kind of acts loudly, because these kind of action, they can be amplified by the, as we say, extremists. So we have to say Jews, they are free of this kind of act, and they have to say loudly, publicly, openly, because people, they are waiting to say, listen, this is what they're doing, and then we turn it to a deep religious war. Thank you.
I mean, it's a big question. I mean, I think we live in a world of widespread war and violence, and of course, you know, a lot of war is not formally recognized as such, but the difference if you're on the receiving end of violence, irrespective of whether it's happening in the context of a formally declared war or not, is slightly academic. I think because we live in a world of deeply disfiguring inequalities. And inequality imprisons both the victims and the superficial winners. And of course, in a highly unequal context over resources, over power, over voice, the people who have the power or the resources are fearful of what will happen if at any point they relinquish control. And the routine humiliation and degradation of people without power and resources leads them to express their frustration in ways that are often not very well controlled. And I think, to be totally honest, that's a lot of what we saw happen on October the 7th. And it doesn't justify what happened on October the 7th, but I think it perhaps helps to put it into a context. I think simply put, people have to start behaving in their interactions with each other as though we were created in the image and likeness of God. And when we encounter another person, we are standing on sacred ground. I think that's what we're missing.
It's got to be the last one.
Earlier, you were talking about the international influence in the area and the responsibility internationals have. I'll just read this little bit from Mr. Balfour, written back in 1914-15, presumably. In the case of Palestine, we deliberately declined to accept the principle of self-determination. We do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit Palestine, which is unbelievable, I think. But also, Mr. Netanyahu, I'm sure he's an intelligent man. His clear aim is to get rid of Hamas. I don't know how by killing one Hamas person, he doesn't realize he's creating another 10.
Okay,
why are journalists not allowed into Gaza? What is he? I mean, he may be hiding nothing, but he's leaving himself open. We lived in Jordan for a while. We heard horrendous stories about what happened when you crossed at the Allenby Bridge into the West Bank and Israel. Nothing may have happened there, I don't know, but we went through the border. Non-Palestinians went one way, Palestinians went another way. And again, the Israelis left themselves open to all sorts of things being said there. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got to draw to a close very soon because I know that Patrick has to leave at 5. It's 5 now. If you want to go, you can. But it's one of those situations where you get to the end of something and actually you've got a whole new set of things to talk about in front of you. But I'm going to ask Michael here, who wanted to just have a little reflection on the previous piece of input.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to the feeling I'm picking up from several people around the room that there's more wars going on now than there kind of were before, because I don't think that's true. I mean, I think if you Google it, I think you'll find there's fewer.
Yeah.
And in fact, people have been fighting each other since the world began. And the reason we live in such danger in our time is not because there are more wars, but because of the awesome and horrendous power of modern weaponry. And we have the ability now, with nuclear weapons, to destroy the world in a way which we never had in the past. And that's why peace becomes an absolute necessity more than at any time in human history.
Fair point.
Well, I've said we have to draw to a close at 5. It is always a problem, this drawing to a close. What I will do is sure, you can in a minute. Everyone else will have something they want to refer to. I'm very sorry. But Patrick does have to go, and I can't let him go without us offering our thanks for him to be here, as well as the thanks for our other two speakers. I'm not going to try and sum up what we've said, because that's impossible. The issues are, if anything, more complex than when I first sat down at 3 o'clock in my mind. So there's no easy kind of picture and conclusion to draw, but certainly more questions have arisen for me, at least since the start of our exchange here. But I'm very grateful to our speakers for actually being a bit vulnerable. You've been a wonderful audience and obeyed all the rules of the game, and for that I'm very kind of pleased and grateful. But it is vulnerable to talk about a situation which looks kind of just impenetrable as well as kind of impossible and so on. Can you use the microphone? I could, yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah.
I'll use a mic, but I'm not going to say all that again. But just to ask you to show appreciation again for the three speakers particularly, but also to say thank you for our volunteers who prepared food and so on, and looked after us, shown us to our seats, etc. There's a good team of those people here at the Minster, so we're grateful for them. If you haven't looked at this table here, there are books for sale, goodness me. And, you'll be better off if you relieve yourself of a few coins to buy them. And over that side there is some food, and I must ask you, get to it, because I don't know what we'll do if lots of it is left. I know a couple of people who wanted to either ask a question or make a point and so on. If it's directed at one person, i.e. one of the two left, I'm sure they wouldn't mind just receiving you, as long as the rules of listening and respect are obeyed. Okay, so you can do that in a minute.
You had a question you wanted to ask again? It was a film you wanted to mention. If you'd like to mention it, go ahead.
Okay, well, if anyone's interested, there's a very good film by Al Jazeera called Jaffa, and I totally recommend it. It's made by an Arab-based broadcasting company, but it contains mostly Israeli academics, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of optimistic.
I too would like to thank you so much for your presentations. Very emotional. It's a difficult situation. I think it breaks our hearts.
I grew up in Libya. I know how it feels. When I talk of my home, where I grew up, I might as well be telling my children about the movement. It's a country that's been destroyed, you know?
In Libya.
Yeah. So much sadness.
You can't recognize the country if you visit it before and after.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So different.
Well, I've been to Syria too, at a time when it was and I worked with a Syrian doctor.
Yes.
And it was so happy, and everybody worked together peacefully. It's happened before,
the thing is, when you use like what sometimes irritates you, that you're always looking for hope. And when you see that political dispute is increasing instead of decreasing, what is the end? What is the end?
Yeah.
Let us see the light at the end of
polarises
the tunnel.
people.
And we don't see that light.
No.
Hopefully, we still have the hope.
I hope so. But it polarises people, doesn't it? Because you're either, if you're not for them, you're against them. And this is creating these dreadful tensions even here, you know, with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. You know, people are forced into one. The middle line, the centre line, is getting lost. And that's the only way forward, isn't it? And we just have these...
It's just we want to be the victims. The number of victims is increasing.
Yes.
Can we just live
and
with
it's,
that?
you know, and it's just devastating. I mean, and when you look ahead, you think, how long is this going to take to repair? You know, this whole generation of children are blighted. You know, what future do our children have?
And I feel like even us watching these images and videos, I feel sometimes I need to go to the doctor or check my well-being. Because I've been crying for so much.
I know.
And every time I see a man who lost his son, I look at my boy and say, would I ever live to lose my son? If I was in his place, how would I
That's what I mean.
save it?
Our whole lives are blighted by so much.
Just want to say thank you so much. I'm one of the vicars here, but I thought you spoke with great strength and passion. The question you don't have to ask, you know, when you've got to displace people like they, then you've got displaced people like, they came back from the war, and you've got all Palestinians. It's complete.
And you're right.
Is there a future in a two-state? Is there a future there? Can you see it?
I don't see it.
You don't see it?
To be realistic, I would lie to myself if I say...
Do you think they should all be in one state and live together?
To me, this is a very, very difficult question to answer.
It is,
I would say it's the leadership now.
Yes.
Science.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely terrible.
It's Fortress Israel, isn't it? This is the trouble. This is the problem.
Sometimes I feel, as I said, there's a secularism in Israel has been reduced. People they become more extremist.
But it's happening everywhere, isn't it?
But how can you have 3 million people in Gaza living in a strip of land?
I think the answer is from America.
You
need to have a strong political will.
Well, you will get a shift in America.
Take our prayers back to cancer, because we need them in cancer at the moment. We need them in cancer. We've got a nice place to work. It's a lovely place for you to work.
Thank you. It was friendly. I met just...
Did you? Oh, bless you.
It was great to have him here.
I like him.
He gave us really good support.
He would do. He would do.
He came to
No, he would. He's a good man.
He's a good man, and he gave really good support for our Muslim community.
I know.
It's a very balanced.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
And a safe journey back. God bless you. God bless. God be with you. Yeah, thank you. And your name is Jesus.
Yes.
I love it. You've got a good laugh when you said that, which is really nice. Really nice.
I said it many times.
My wife teaches A level, RS, and she teaches the Islam paper. She teaches Islam to A level. Yeah, and she gets great results.
Wow.
She gets great results.
In
the school outside Reading, in Pangbourne near here. She teaches the sixth form, boys and girls. She teaches and takes them. Every year she goes and takes them up to the mosque in Regent's Park. And they spend a day out there. But
if you need any tips from him, you should seek help, because she's a good Islamic teacher.
She is. And she understands.
Does she wear hijab as well?
Oh, she knows all about it. And they had a food festival last week, and they had Islamic food, and they had Christian food, and they had Jewish food. But she's she's passionate about it. Because she believes unless you understand the faith, you can't live with it.
Welcome to visit. It would be great to see you.
You are in Canterbury.
Yeah, we only have one mosque in Canterbury.
I'll find it. I'll Google it. I'm sure if you Google it, we'll find you.
Welcome anytime.
Love to see you. You bless yourself.
Thank you.
good.
So you think the solution is for the sit down? Yes.
There's obviously the first step is to try and manage truths, to stop the fighting, and then to make the last
it's not really clear to me. Should I agree with the solution? What is really in it? No, as in, yeah, the solution. As in a solution to, what do you think about, like, are they supposed to live together? Is that the solution? To agree to share the land?
I am here, but that's not right.
Oh, it was down here.
Oh, where? Oh, yes.